The leaders of the Allied powers, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, met at Yalta, February 1945, to discuss how to achieve final victory over Nazi Germany, following an earlier similar meeting in Tehran in 1943. This given scenario explores a hypothetical, alternate outcome to the preceding example, where 2.2 Churchill, Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin adopt an entirely different attitude at Yalta, the immediate result of which completely changes what we know of the history of the Cold War. The place could be where one finds themselves to be, or the feeling a person has when they're around with this person. What are major aspects that partake in the process of a setting is the way a person talks and treats another, or the foods, clothes, and songs they enjoy with one another. Also, in the setting could be the way a person feels about receiving flowers from someone he or she loves, or the aunt who insists on using a whip in order to make the best meringue. That's all a setting is, right? Wrong. Beneath the chandeliers and ornate ceilings of the opulent Levadia Palace on the Black Sea coast in the present-day region of Crimea, the post-war world order was starting to take shape. The summit was held in a somewhat jubilant atmosphere. The Europe First War was nearing its end. The Allied leaders, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Premier Joseph Stalin, came to the conference with divergent post-war plans. Proposed improvement. The discussions of Yalta are underway, and President Roosevelt makes a surprisingly bold proposition to his fellow leaders. Acknowledging the imperativeness of a stable and allied post-war Europe, President Roosevelt suggests the creation of a United States of Europe, a federal union of European countries created to promote peace, prosperity, and self-determined democratic governance on the continent. First, I started reading by times from 6:30 a.m. 11:30 a.m. and I realized that how many times I'm going to read, the more I'm going to predict what's going to happen, and get familiar with the short story, and the less I'm going to pay attention to it. Reading by time reminds me to keep reading for a purpose. Another thing that I started doing was discussing when I got a discussion time, and after I read a passage, I write thoughts and questions I'm thinking about. Secondly, I learned nothing because the story remained the same. Then, two things I can remembered about writing prediction was whenever I wrote, I felt free to write anything. For what I see and is not going to be me, then everything came out, checked with the story. Churchill looked sideways at Stalin, while Roosevelt explained his plan. They both knew how dangerous this was for Europe. He saw the possibilities of the project but was skeptical that it could reduce Britain's influence. Stalin was even more skeptical. It was a joke. What would it do to all his carefully constructed empires in Eastern Europe? Negotiations and compromises are a leading factor that takes place at the Constitutional Convention. Stalin negotiated with Roosevelt was to agree on keeping Germany not aggressive, the start of a new Europe. The leaders worked for days arguing and striking details. Finally, they agreed on an historic compromise, a plan that laid the groundwork for a united Europe. The first provision was for a federal government with powers granted to it by the member states. There would be a common defense policy. There would be means of settling disputes and promoting cooperation among members of the Federation. Each of the states would be pledged to abstain from aggression against one another, and their territorial rights would be guaranteed. And so these leaders began what has been a long, slow effort at the unification of Europe, and just the beginnings have been made. The outcome of the Vietnam War, debates over what form a united Europe should take, consume the continent in the immediate post-war years, as numerous plans are proposed. All the various plans call for paring down the traditional nation-state, a process known as supranatism. The French propose a European assembly with a French socialist appointed as the first president. De Gaulle denounces this as farce and fraud and perilous to France's recovery. De Gaulle calls instead for a united Europe, signifying a consolidation of the European nations so far that it will resemble what went on in the 1930s. That is a situation where one or two nations dominate, which meant Nazi Germany. The division between the two main European countries, France and Germany, was still open and intense, and the community idea seemed to be a way of ending the post-war isolation of France. French were left to deal with Germans and refused to discuss matters with either Russia or America, and of ending and banning conflicts. The Yalta Conference was an entirely new experiment in world diplomacy, stimulated by the development of a new type of war, a war in which every belligerent became involved, and not just the professional soldiers among the belligerents, as in former times. World War II involved the peoples as much as their arms, the direct and vital part played by the peoples helping infinitely to determine the final outcome. The Yalta Conference is looked back on as a watershed moment for the world, not for actions that would well describe the Cold War era, instead for the feeling of unity and collaborativeness that was able to overcome countless points of conflict. This creates a United States of Europe, affecting the political order in Europe, transitioning it into a period of peace, wealth, and stability. Therefore, I believe that both rental car and driving school industries are going to continue to grow in the future. If we suppose that, in the circumstances of the time, the leaders at Yalta had been able to jump out of the last chapter of the Yalta Papers, the Department of State history of the conference, and look sternly at Molotov, if he could have stood to look in a mirror, say, "You don't have any area over there any more than we do here. What you want is to take away our friends, just as we did yours, the Polish government and the Baltic states, and put in communists in their places, and to provide you with buffer states against what you say is our hostile intention of invading you, and is what we say is your hostile intention of invading us. And so if we could put self-interest out of this, and especially over here, it is clear that in these days it makes no more sense to the British to send their sons to the Chinese war than it would for you to send yours to Europe. What we should be doing is to quit quarreling over which of us should run this country, and together help Europeans to run their own. And if we'll do that, then how they run them won't matter. And if by some miracle the French, no Frenchman is ever run out of town on a witch hunt. They still admit they go where the money is, if it made monetary sense for the French government to stay in with whatever compromise Europe came up with. Then the ECA money could have been for Eastern Europe too, instead of just for 6 Western European countries. And from the end of 1947, the Jews who had to leave Poland because they fought with us in the English Air Force could have gone to their homes, or any Jews in Eastern Europe who wanted to deal with them when they tried. And Europe would have just said, "You're broke and the war is over. We have peace plans for you, and regardless of whatever faults you find with them, we probably couldn't do worse for you than you've done for yourselves. And anyhow, as the Russian says, they'll make a change from the war."